Hello and welcome to IndiTalk. This is a show on which we discuss issues, controversial issues of national importance. And today is just about 2 days after World Press Freedom Day as declared by the United Nations, UNESCO, and the whole world is celebrating what is one of the most essential components of liberal democracy, which is the right to express yourself, to be able to keep your government under a check, and to be able to make sure that you tell truth to power, as the saying now goes. Now, in a democracy, we all have our crosses to bear. In India, right now, the threat to the freedom of the press is perhaps greater than it was in a long time. In fact, the World Press Freedom Index, as compiled by Reporters Without Borders, today puts India at 136, just barely above Pakistan or other so-called non-free states, in a list of 180 countries. It is well known now that the reporters in India face dangers. They have been shot at, they've been killed. Many of them have been subjected to mass attacks, to trolling. But the world goes on and India goes on, and reporters don't easily give up, as our newspapers will show, and as is proven by the increasing momentum that is gathering once again in order to check the transgressions on the freedom of the press. The latest example of this being a letter from over 100 journalists, media, online journalists, to Information and Broadcasting Minister Smriti Irani, fiercely protesting the INB Ministry's attempts to shackle online broadcasting and online media reporting on websites and portals, in fact applying the same standards to them as are applied to television and other sort of controls. What they're saying is that online reporting, for all its faults, for all its vulnerability to fake news and to propaganda, still happens to be an avenue through which the people and the non-organized press, the press that is not backed by huge amounts of money or powerhouses, can still get the truth to the public, and restrictions of that sort would severely curtail its independence. And the INB ministry is taking a second look at what could be a second draconian effort by the INB ministry to put curbs on the press, following its earlier aborted recommendation or order under which a journalist could be arrested merely on the basis of an accusation that he or she is an author of fake news. Now, let us look at the judiciary and the press. See, both have their crosses to bear. The judiciary must look at the evidence and come to reasoned conclusions about the freedom of an individual under trial or punishment to be meted out to those guilty. The press has a right to report. The judges have a right to ignore the press, and the press, without falling into contempt, have also a right to second guess judgments that are delivered, to be critical objectively about judgments, as well as to continue reporting on subjects that are sometimes controversial and on which judgments have already been given, in the hope that perhaps a new set of circumstances might prompt the judiciary to perhaps even reopen a case that has happened quite often. See, one of the things that I find very harrowing is the argument that just because it is a newspaper, quote unquote, story or a media story, the judiciary should not take it seriously. Now, this was one of the arguments that was used during the petition to the Supreme Court, in which the petitioners asked that the death of Judge Loya, the CBI special judge who died under suspicious circumstances, should be investigated to remove any element of doubt. And one of the arguments used by those opposing the petitioner was, well, this is only a newspaper story after all, and this story is 3 years old. Well, it's true, Judge Loya died apparently of a cardiac arrest in 2014, and the first stories came out 2.5 to 3 years later in Caravan magazine, but it took a 2.5-year investigation, which included hundreds of interviews and 22 different stories, for the magazine to be able to conduct this copious research and come up with its findings. And even though the Supreme Court dismissed the case, the Caravan magazine and its reporters continue to stand squarely behind their story and the facts. Well, the judges had their own reasons, but the journalists too must have their own reasons to continue to probe into a story which they think was fair and reported with the amount of due diligence that any good reporter should exercise in doing a serious and an extremely sensitive story of this sort. Now, again, let's get back to this only a newspaper report. You know, in 1957, India's first Watergate broke. This was the Mundra scandal. It broke as a newspaper story and was taken up in Parliament by none other than Jawaharlal Nehru's son-in-law, Feroz Gandhi, who asked a question on the floor of Parliament whether the life insurance company had sold certain shares by favouring a private company. And that led to a huge expose in which the Finance Minister of India, T.T. Krishnamachari, had to resign. And remember, the argument in Parliament at that time by the Congress itself was, well, you're only basing these questions on newspaper reports. Well, it is those newspaper reports that ultimately turned out to be true and led to the first resignation of a senior minister in Nehru's cabinet because of a public scandal. Let's look at the international world. In the international world, one of the most powerful, iconic investigative stories ever written was by Seymour Hersh. This had to do with the My Lai massacre, a small village in Vietnam, where a year and a half earlier, American soldiers had gone in and killed hundreds of innocent men, women and children, burnt them, raped them, and completely destroyed their village. Now, this atrocity was given out by the official American media, by the Pentagon, by the Defense Department, basically as a massive fight, a real hot-blooded battle between the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong and American troops, where it was not such a battle at all. It was just a plain cold-blooded murder. But it took Seymour Hersh, who then won the Pulitzer Prize, over a year to investigate the facts, tell his story in the newspaper, and because of the newspapers, the entire American company which had indulged in this atrocity was court-martialed, brought under trial, and the commander of those troops was ultimately jailed. Now, if you look at other newspaper stories, you look at the worldwide Me Too movement, aimed at abolishing the culture of impunity by the male power structure which exploits women. A lot of the women who have come forward today, and a lot of action, including court cases that are being filed today, happened maybe 10 to 15 years ago, but women have just spoken up about these injustices against them. And they're being taken extremely seriously. And many of these incidents have first been reported in the press. So again, that argument that just because this came out in the press or because it's years old, actually has no value. Now, let's look at some others in India. where the press has played an extremely important part in exposing scandals and telling truth to power to make sure that Indian democracy works and Indian politicians and powerful people are held accountable. The Hindu's Bofor's expose, for example, the scandal broke in 1987 on Swedish radio, and yet probably did bring down the Rajiv Gandhi government some years later, when VP Singh used this scandal in a national election. And of course the matter went to the courts, Supreme Court, and parts of it are still under trial. Then you look at Tehelka's, the defense deal expose in 2001, publishing investigative reports called Operation West End, which published secret videotapes of officials and ministers taking bribes from defense contractors. The Indian Express's cement scam expose of 1981, when Arun Shourie was the editor, and almost overnight Arun Shourie became a national hero for conspicuously studying and fearlessly pursuing investigative journalism. And the repressible Pinu Modi, he remarked, "Can you imagine the improved state of the nation if we had 10 Arun Shouries working instead of one?" And then the Indian Express's human trafficking expose. It's very famous. A journalist many years ago called Ashwani Sareen actually went and purchased a woman, showing how women could actually be sold in human trafficking. More recently, we had Open Magazine's Nira Radia tapes in 2010. It carried transcripts of telephone conversations between the lobbyists and people in power. And one of the fallouts of the story was that the government terminated all commercial engagements with the Outlook group of magazines, then headed by Vinod Mehta, the late Vinod Mehta, but of course he did not back off. This ultimately goes to the very heart of what is central to Indian democracy, and which is accountability. And there is no better institution than the press, a responsible press, for getting truth to power and holding power accountable. So I'd like to end this with my favorite quotes. That one is, the truth is something that someone is trying to hide. The rest is advertising. And the second favorite quote of mine, perhaps I like it better than the first one. That this is from the great Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of America, who said that if I had to choose between a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. That's all for today for IndiTalk. I'm Inderjit Badhwar, and we'll be back again with another controversial topic. Until then, catch us.